Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are taking a deep, honestly fascinating dive into what is universally recognized as the oldest, most famous, and perhaps most fiercely debated military treatise in human history, The Art of War. Now, whether you're a historian, a business leader, or just someone who's really into human psychology, you have definitely heard of Sun Tzu. But as we're going to uncover today, the story behind this text and the man himself is absolutely packed with brutal history and some shocking academic mysteries. Okay, let's dive into this. Our roadmap for today starts with the core philosophy, the ultimate goal of the text. Then we'll hit a visceral, high-stakes historical narrative that put this philosophy to a ruthless test, map out the 13 chapters, look at some surprising blunders in its Western translation, and finally, unpack a great historical mystery. Did Sun Tzu actually even exist? Part 1. The ultimate goal. Supreme excellence is winning without fighting. I want you to think about that for a second, because this single quote completely shatters our common misconceptions about warfare. The core theme of The Art of War isn't about brute force. It's not about bloody clashes or just throwing bodies at a problem. No, it is all about achieving victory through intelligence, strategy, and adaptability. It's about dismantling your opponent's strategy, breaking their alliances, and positioning yourself so perfectly that the enemy simply realizes they have already lost, well before a single sword is even drawn. Part 2. The Ruthless Test. So the story goes that Sun Tzu's writings brought him to the attention of King Ho-Lu of the Wu's state. The king asks him, "Hey, may I submit your theory of managing soldiers to a slight test? May it be applied to women?" Sun Tzu says yes. So the king brings out 180 of his palace ladies, including his 2 favorite concubines, who are made company commanders. Sun Tzu arms them with spears and gives a basic drill instruction: right turn. Well, the women just burst out laughing. Sun Tzu doesn't flinch. He calmly states that if the words of command are not clear, the general is to blame. So he patiently re-explains the drill. Then he orders left turn, and again, fits of laughter. So the crucial point here is his cold, calculated logic. Sun Tzu announces, if words of command are not clear and distinct, if orders are not thoroughly understood, the general is to blame. But if his orders are clear and the soldiers nevertheless disobey, then it is the fault of their officers. And with that, he immediately orders the 2 favorite concubines to be beheaded. The king, who's watching all this from a pavilion, is absolutely horrified. I mean, he desperately sends down a message pleading for their lives, practically begging, saying his meat and drink would lose all their savor without them. But Sun Tzu stands with immovable defiance. He replies that having received the king's commission as general, there are certain commands of the king he simply cannot accept if they compromise military discipline. And he executes the concubines. The result? The next time the drum sounded, the women performed every single maneuver with terrifying, silent precision. Sun Tzu had proven his absolute mastery of discipline, and for that, he was officially appointed as general. Let's move to part 3 and see how this builds into the 13 chapters. And this brilliantly illustrates how the text isn't just a random list of tips. It's an incredibly interconnected ecosystem of strategic thinking. From laying plans all the way to the use of spies, the text meticulously categorizes the elements of conflict. It creates these thematic buckets that treat warfare almost as a pure science of human behavior and environmental awareness. Embedded right within these chapters is what we can call the cycle of victory. Warfare flows step by step. You've got information, then calculation, positioning, deception, execution, and finally, adaptation. Sun Tzu argues that you literally have to repeat this cycle continuously. If you control this flow, you control the battle. And if you control the battle, you control the outcome. Now, one of the absolute pillars of this cycle is deception. Sun Tzu explicitly states that all warfare is based on deception. It's entirely about psychological mastery. You are weaponizing perception. So if you're strong, you have to appear weak to draw the enemy into a trap. You confuse them, you isolate them from their allies, and you shape their mindset so they make fatal errors before you even engage. The goal is to break the enemy's strategy, not their people. Equally important is terrain. This is about having total situational awareness. Sun Tzu details various types of ground, accessible, entangling, precipitous, and exactly how your physical behavior has to adjust to each one of them. But it goes way deeper than that, transitioning from the physical to the purely psychological. The highly aware leader sees the invisible. They look at dust rising in the distance to see movement. They listen to noise to detect disorder. It's about taking the natural environment and literally turning it into an active weapon in your arsenal, because good terrain equals an easier victory. Part 4, Lost in Translation.
Now, what's really interesting is the translation history. You'd think a masterpiece like this would be treated with extreme care, right? Well, early European translations were spectacularly incompetent. Back in 1782, a French Jesuit inexplicably added a huge amount of text that Sun Tzu never even wrote. Decades later, the first English translation in 1905 by Captain Calthrop was deemed excessively bad, which is basically a polite scholar's way of saying it was a total disaster of blunders and omissions. It actually wasn't until Dr. Lionel Giles came along in 1910 that the world finally received a definitive, highly scholarly translation with accurate notes. Dr. Giles, who was a leading sinologist at the British Museum, was profoundly motivated by a real sense of scholarly justice here. He wrote with genuine reverence, stating, "I could not help feeling that Sun Tzu deserved a better fate than had befallen him." Giles basically rescued the text from the mutilations of his predecessors, and in doing so, he laid the meticulous groundwork for the modern understanding of the art of war that we all rely on today. Which brings us to part 5, the great historical mystery. Here is a wild fact. Historians are heavily divided on whether Sun Tzu even existed. On one side, we have the skeptics, who argue that Sun Tzu, the legendary general who drilled those concubines in conquered states, is nothing but a myth. On the flip side, we have the believers, who look at the internal evidence of the text and say, no, the author was absolutely a real, distinct historical genius. Let's look impartially at the evidence from both camps. First up, the skeptic's case, which was famously championed by the scholar Ye Shui-sin. The most glaring piece of evidence for them is an omission. Sun Tzu's name does not appear at all in the Tzu Chuan, which is the greatest contemporary historical record of that era. I mean, how could a general of such brilliant fame, who supposedly captured the capital of Chu, be completely ignored by the premier historians of his own time? Plus, skeptics argue that the class of professional generals didn't even exist during the period he supposedly lived. They believe the text was written much later, by some anonymous, theorizing scholar, and that the story of the concubines, just a reckless fabrication. But the believers have some really incredible counter-evidence. They point out that the text was actively plagiarized by other historical figures like Wu Qi only a century later, which proves the text had to exist early on. Moreover, the vocabulary in the text is deeply archaic, containing words that were completely obsolete in later dynasties. But the most compelling point, the text heavily references armored chariot warfare and very specific systems of ancient land tenure. Armored chariots completely died out before the end of the Chou dynasty. A later forger wouldn't have written about obsolete warfare as if it were current. So we are left with a massive historical cliffhanger here. Is Sun Tzu merely a pen name? Just an amalgamation of ancient theorizing pundits whose ideas were compiled centuries later? Or was he a real, single, forgotten genius whose name somehow slipped through the cracks of the official royal chronicles, maybe because he didn't hold a civil office? We're going to leave that evidence for you to weigh. But here is the ultimate takeaway. Regardless of whether the author was a lone, ruthless genius from the Wu state or a collection of brilliant minds from a later era, the text itself stands on its own. It is a timeless masterpiece. Its observations on human psychology, organizational discipline, and the absolute necessity of preparation remain just as piercingly accurate today as they were 2.5 millennia ago. Which leaves us with a final thought for you. The physical battlefields of ancient China, they're long gone. But the strategic flow of information, calculation, positioning, and adaptation is eternal. Look at your own life, your business, your negotiations. How can you apply the principle of winning without fighting to your own modern battles? Think about that for a bit, and we'll see you in the next explainer.